I didn't leave my life all at once. That's the lie people tell themselves, that one day you wake up and make a dramatic decision. For me, it happened quietly, in inches, in years that slid past without resistance. By the time I noticed something was wrong, I was already gone. If you're listening to this at night, maybe with the lights off, let me tell you something honestly. I stayed longer than I should have because staying felt safer than admitting I was already lost. I remember the exact moment I realized I was living on autopilot. I was standing in my kitchen, staring at a mug I didn't remember buying, in an apartment that felt like a waiting room. Nothing was wrong. That was the problem. Nothing hurt enough to force me to move. And nothing mattered enough to make me stay. I used to believe life would announce itself when it was time to change. A disaster. A betrayal. A dramatic ending. But life doesn't always do that. Sometimes it just slowly turns the volume down until you stop hearing your own thoughts. People around me said I was stable, responsible, reliable. Those words felt like chains disguised as compliments. I had a routine that worked, a job that paid, conversations that repeated themselves like reruns. On the surface, it was a good life. Inside, it was a quiet erosion. I didn't hate my mornings. I just didn't feel them. I didn't dread my evenings. I endured them. Days stacked neatly on top of each other like blank pages I never bothered to write on. There was a version of me that once dreamed loudly. I remember that person the way you remember a childhood friend you lost touch with. Fondly. Vaguely. Without urgency. I told myself that growing up meant letting go of impossible ideas. I didn't realize I was also letting go of myself. The first real crack appeared when I stopped making decisions. I didn't choose things anymore. I accepted them. Invitations, expectations, obligations. It was easier to say yes than to explain why I felt nothing. Easier to comply than to confront the terrifying question of what I actually wanted. I told myself I was being patient, mature, practical. In reality, I was postponing my own existence. Sometimes late at night, I would sit in silence and feel an unfamiliar pressure in my chest. Not sadness. Not anxiety. Something emptier. Like a room that had been abandoned but still remembered what laughter sounded like. I started losing time. Weeks passed without memory. Conversations blurred. I would look back at photos and feel like I was observing someone else's life. I smiled in those pictures. That scared me more than if I hadn't. There was a moment small, insignificant to anyone else that changed everything. I overheard someone describe me. They said I was settled. That word landed like a verdict. Settled. As if I had arrived somewhere permanent without ever deciding to go there. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake realizing that I had built a life designed to be unremarkable so it wouldn't ask anything of me. I had traded intensity for predictability, depth for safety, curiosity for comfort. And somehow convinced myself that was wisdom. The truth was harder. I was afraid to start over. Afraid to be bad at something again. Afraid to disappoint people who had grown comfortable with the version of me that asked for nothing. So I stayed. I stayed while my inner voice grew quieter. I stayed while my days lost their edges. I stayed while my reflection began to look unfamiliar, like someone wearing my face better than I ever did. And the worst part, no one stopped me. Because from the outside, nothing looked wrong. I began to understand that regret doesn't always come from mistakes. Sometimes it comes from endurance. From tolerating a life that slowly convinces you this is all there is. I told myself I could leave anytime. That thought became a lullaby I used to fall asleep inside a life I wasn't living. Years passed like this. Not painfully. Comfortably. That's what makes it dangerous. Until one evening, While walking home through streets I could navigate blindfolded, I realized something terrifying. If nothing changed, this would be my entire story. No turning point. No reinvention. Just a quiet fade out. I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk and felt a wave of panic rise for the first time in years. Not because something bad was happening but because nothing ever would. That was when I understood the cost of staying. Not loss. Not failure. But disappearance. I went home that night knowing I couldn't continue like this. And also knowing that leaving would destroy the version of me everyone relied on. Including the version I had pretended to be. I didn't know yet how I would leave. Or who I would become. I only knew one thing. If I stayed any longer, there would be nothing left to save. Once I admitted to myself that I was disappearing, I expected clarity to follow. A plan. Courage. Some dramatic certainty. What I got instead was fear so quiet it felt like reason. Leaving meant loss. Not the kind people talk about openly, but the invisible kind. The loss of explanations that made sense. The loss of a version of me others trusted. The loss of a future that was already written and therefore required no effort. I started noticing how deeply my life was entangled with expectations I never chose. My calendar wasn't mine. My priorities weren't mine. Even my opinions felt rehearsed, shaped to fit rooms I no longer wanted to be in. I had become fluent in agreement. I tested the idea of leaving in small ways. I said no to things I had always said yes to. I cancelled plans without providing elaborate excuses. Each time, nothing terrible happened. The world didn't collapse. People adjusted. That realization was both freeing and devastating. Because it meant I had stayed for reasons that barely existed anymore. I began to imagine different versions of my life, not grand fantasies, just quieter, truer alternatives. Waking up somewhere unfamiliar. Being unknown. Making choices without witnesses. The thought scared me, but it also made my chest feel lighter. Still, fear fought back hard. It whispered practical concerns. Money. Stability. Reputation. It reminded me how long it had taken to build this life, how irresponsible it would be to walk away from something functional just because it felt empty. I listened to that voice for a long time. It sounded like wisdom. It sounded like everyone I had ever admired for being reasonable. But late at night, another voice emerged. Softer. Older. It didn't argue. It didn't threaten. It simply asked, again and again, is this really how you want to spend the rest of your time? Time. That word began to haunt me. I started counting years backward. How long since I felt alive, how long since I surprised myself, how long since I made a decision without asking how it would look from the outside. The answers were unbearable. One evening, I sat alone and imagined myself 10 years in the future, still here, still performing the same careful routines. The image felt unbearable, like a warning my body understood before my mind did. My chest tightened. My hands shook. For the first time in years, I cried not from pain, but from recognition. That was the night I accepted a brutal truth. I wasn't trapped. I was choosing comfort over truth every single day. And that choice was costing me my identity. I didn't announce my decision. I didn't dramatize it. I started preparing quietly, like someone planning an escape from a place no one believes is a prison. I reduced my life to essentials. I noticed how little of it actually mattered. Objects lost their meaning quickly when I imagined carrying them somewhere new. Conversations felt hollow once I knew I was already halfway gone. People sensed something, even if they couldn't name it. They asked if I was tired. If I needed a vacation. I smiled and said I was fine. It was easier than explaining that I was dismantling myself. The hardest part wasn't fear. It was guilt. Guilt for wanting more when nothing was technically wrong. Guilt for leaving roles I had fulfilled well. Guilt for choosing uncertainty over dependability. But beneath the guilt was a deeper understanding. Staying would be a slow betrayal. Leaving would be an honest one. The night before I left, I walked through my space one last time. I expected nostalgia. Instead, I felt relief. Like someone setting down a heavy bag they didn't realize they were carrying. I didn't take much with me. Just enough to survive. The rest belonged to a version of me that had already ended. As I closed the door, I realized something unsettling. I wasn't running away. I was stepping toward myself for the first time in years. And that terrified me more than anything I had ever done. Because starting over doesn't promise happiness. It only promises truth. And truth is unforgiving. I left without telling most people. Not out of cruelty, but because explanations would have turned my departure into a debate. And this wasn't something that could be negotiated. As the distance grew, so did the silence. No one chased me. No one stopped me. The world adjusted with alarming ease. And in that quiet, a question emerged that I hadn't prepared for. If I was no longer who I had been, then who was I now? Starting over didn't feel like freedom. It felt like standing in an empty room after a fire, unsure what could be rebuilt and what was lost forever. Without the familiar weight of my old life, I felt disturbingly light. Undefined. Exposed. In the beginning, no one knew me. That anonymity was supposed to be liberating. Instead, it was disorienting. Without a past to reference, I didn't know how to introduce myself, not to others, not even in my own head. I realized how much of my identity had been borrowed from roles, routines, and repetition. There were mornings when I woke up with a sudden jolt of panic, convinced I had made a catastrophic mistake. On those days, the temptation to go back was almost unbearable. The old life still existed, intact, waiting like a room I had stepped out of briefly. I could return. Apologize. Reassume my place. Nothing irreversible had happened yet. But something inside me resisted. Not with confidence, but with stubborn honesty. Going back would mean proving that my leaving had been a mistake. And deep down, I knew it wasn't. I began to live slowly. Painfully aware of every decision. There was no script anymore. No expectations to hide behind. Every choice carried weight, because it was mine. Loneliness came in waves. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet realization that no one was thinking about me at all. I had believed my absence would leave a mark. It didn't. Life continued seamlessly without me. That truth hurt more than any rejection. But it also taught me something essential. If I was so easily replaced, then my worth had never been in my usefulness. It had been in my presence. And presence is something you have to actively choose. I made mistakes. Small ones. Embarrassing ones. I said the wrong things. Trusted the wrong people. Doubt crept in constantly, asking if reinvention was just another illusion. Some nights, I missed the numb certainty of my old routines. At least they had known outcomes. Then, gradually, something changed. I started noticing moments again. The way time felt when it wasn't being killed. The strange satisfaction of choosing how to spend an afternoon. The unfamiliar ache of caring deeply about small things. I wasn't happy. Not consistently. But I was awake. One evening, while walking alone through unfamiliar streets, I realized I was no longer measuring my life against the one I had left. The comparison had faded quietly, without ceremony. That's when I understood I had crossed an invisible line. I hadn't escaped my life. I had ended it, and endings, I learned, don't require permission. There are still days when regret visits me. Not for leaving, but for staying as long as I did. For silencing myself out of fear. For confusing endurance with strength. for believing that a life without pain was the same as a life with meaning. If you're listening to this and feeling that dull, persistent emptiness, the kind that doesn't scream but never leaves, I need you to hear this clearly. You don't need a disaster to justify change. You don't need permission to want more. And you don't owe anyone your disappearance. Starting over doesn't mean erasing your past. It means refusing to let it decide your future. I didn't find myself by leaving. I found myself by finally choosing. And that choice, as terrifying as it was, gave me something my old life never could. Time that actually belonged to me. That's the secret no one tells you. Life doesn't collapse when you walk away. It simply reveals how much of it was never truly yours. If you're standing at the edge, afraid to move because nothing is technically wrong, remember this. Staying is also a decision. And it's the one that costs you the most.